many times in medicine, in medical device design, in regulatory affairs and clinical trials, we're focusing on the wrong information, the wrong part of the problem. In other words, what good is getting the right answer if we're asking the wrong question? Unfortunately, this happens a lot. You know, coming from a medical background myself, I'll tell you more about myself in just a moment. I used to teach medical school. There's an adage that we would use in medical school, and that is the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. How many of you have heard this before? The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the engineering equivalent of that is that we designed the medical device perfectly, and yet the patient died anyway. The regulatory equivalent of that is that we followed the regulation perfectly. That is, we did all that FDA or Health Canada or whoever asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. Unfortunately, these things happen more frequently than some people would like to admit. And that's one of the many recurring themes that I hope to share with you this afternoon. So before getting into the content, let me just share with you a tiny bit of my background. And by the way, there is a handout available with this presentation that will have my bio in it. My background is in biomedical engineering. That's what my PhD is in, although I don't do a lot of engineering per se anymore. I consult for a wide variety of companies, not just medical device companies, but also drug and biotech companies. I also work as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And quite frankly, the reason why I mention that is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence, and I really try to use that to my advantage. In addition to that, I teach part-time at a couple of different schools, and I'm a contributing editor to several very large medical technology and regulatory publications in the world. I would suggest either checking out my website or my LinkedIn site. You'll find links to a lot of the columns and articles and podcasts and webinars that I've done on a wide variety of different topics, including the one that brings you here today, and that is the pre-submission process. So that's just a tiny bit about me. I just want to see kind of where we are as an audience before we start digging into the content. How many of you have communicated with the FDA in some fashion in the past? Okay, maybe a third of you or so. How many of you currently communicate in some fashion with the FDA now? Okay. How many of you anticipate communicating with FDA at some point in the future? Okay, that's probably why many of you are here. And finally, what do you hope to learn? We have about 2 hours together, so that's a nice chunk of time. There's a lot to share with you regarding the pre-sub process. A lot of people use it. Very few people, very few companies use it well. And I'll get into that in just a moment. And again, not to be arrogant by any means, but I've got a ton of pre-sub experience with FDA. I've done there at least once a month, sometimes more, doing pre-subs. I've done more pre-subs than a lot of my reviewer friends at the agency. So like any tool, the pre-sub, when it's used effectively by somebody that knows what they're doing, can get great results. But like any tool, when it's used by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, can be disastrous. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to share with you today. So what I want to talk about in the time that we have together this afternoon is what's the pre-submission process and when should we use it? And by the way, for those of you that do not already know me, I will not be insulting your intelligence by reading the regulation and the guidance to you. I'm assuming that all of you have graduated from elementary school. You all know how to read. I'm not being condescending here. I'm really not. But one of my big frustrations when I go to a lot of conferences, especially RAPS or DIA or something like that, most people, all they do is they literally copy and paste from the regulation or the guidance into the PowerPoint. And they say, let me further insult your intelligence by reading it to you. That's not my intent here. As a matter of fact, as we'll talk about, I characterize the entire relationship between the company and the FDA as a poker game, in every sense of the word. And just because somebody understands the rules of poker doesn't mean they're going to be a good poker player, and it certainly doesn't mean they're going to win the game. I want to do everything that I can, legal of course. I don't want to be wearing the orange jumpsuits in order to win the game. Suffice it to say, you can read 50 books on the rules of poker. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good poker player. Regulation, including the pre-sub, it's exactly the same. You can read the guidance, and if you haven't, I would suggest that you do read the guidance, just so that you know what's in there. But that's just the beginning. That's not the end. How does the process work, and what can you expect? And I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of tips and tricks, as many as I can cram in as time permits. And then I'll wrap this up with some final thoughts, and I'm looking forward to having some good discussion at the end. A quick, important disclaimer: I can't possibly make you an expert in this in just the few minutes that we have together. I'm not even going to try. But I do want to share with you my philosophy of education, which you can summarize on a fortune cookie, and that is to teach you how to think, not what to think. To teach you how to think, not what to think. And when you think about it, this is a very uncommon approach in education in general, in medicine, and in regulatory affairs in particular. But it is my approach to teach you how to think, not what to think. And speaking of thinking, oftentimes people ask me, is it possible to think regulatory? Well, the late great Carl Sagan said that science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. Well, my spin on Dr. Sagan's quote is regulatory affairs is a way of thinking much more than it's a body of rules and regulations, or at least it should be. You know, we have too many people, quite frankly, who are just following regulation like a recipe, kind of like a computer executing lines of code one after another without ever asking the question, does it make sense? This is why we have problems like we follow the regulation perfectly, but the patient died anyway. So the solution, and this is a topic of a different discussion, obviously, the solution is not to create more regulation, because we already got tons and tons of that. The solution is to get people to think. That's not such an easy thing to do. So if we took this approach, and granted this is a very uncommon approach, but if we took it, perhaps Dr. Sagan would be proud. Okay, so before we dig in specifically to the pre-sub, I just want to set the stage here, because the pre-sub is only one method of many that we can communicate with the FDA. And I kind of break this into two camps, formal versus informal. So on the formal side, we have the pre-submission process for medical devices, which is kind of similar to the pre-IND process for drugs. There are some important differences, which I will not get into here, but they're kind of the same. And for those of you that might be interested in combination products, communicating with the agency in advance in the form of a pre-sub or a pre-IND or whatever the heck you call it, I have no idea. That's a topic of a much more advanced discussion. But again, not to toot my own horn, I've been involved in combination products now for more than 20 years, long before most people have heard that phrase. As I mentioned a moment ago, I consult not just for FDA, but Health Canada. Several years ago, Health Canada hired me to help them develop their official Canadian policy for combination products. So if you're working in combo products, I'd be happy to talk to you. Maybe there's something I can do to help. There's also the request for information, the 513G. I'm not a fan of that. You can use it if you want to, but I don't use it. I usually opt for a pre-sub instead. And there's also something called the request for designation, or RFD, that some of you might be familiar with. And now there's actually a new version, sort of new, called the pre-RFD, the pre-request for designation. This is a guidance that just came out in February. So actually, this is the continuation of a trend. We have pre-IND, we have pre-sub, we have pre-RFD. There's going to be a whole bunch of pre-this and that and the other things. By the way, there's absolutely nothing new here. This is just nothing more than what used to be an informal RFD, and now we're calling it a pre-RFD. Shakespeare said a rose by the name still smells as sweet. So we can call it whatever we want, but the most important thing is that we communicate with the agency in advance of the submission, as we'll talk about. So what is it? Typically it's a submission to the Office of Combination Products, but this is not unique to combination products. You can use this for monotherapies, like straight-up medical devices, if there's a question on whether or not it's a regulated medical device. For those of you that are into wellness devices, under the wellness exemption, and I did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago if anybody's interested, there is no formal way yet to go to the FDA to present your wellness device to them to make sure that they see it the same way, that it's exempt from all FDA regulation. I think there needs to be one, and I've recommended to FDA for a while that there needs to be one. Right now, what I'm recommending to people in that situation is to use the pre-RFD process. So again, for those of you that are not familiar with it, you can talk to me about it later. That's on the formal side. On the informal side, you can contact DICE, the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. You can basically ask them any question that you want. For those of you that are U.S. citizens, you're paying their salary anyway, so you might as well use them. My all-time favorite, and remains my favorite, is the old-fashioned meet and greet, where you do nothing more than call up the reviewers and say, hey, we'd like to come down, shake hands, tell you a little bit about our device, what we're up to, what we've done thus far. If all goes well, we'll come back to you with a few months for an update. This is my all-time favorite. We used to do this a lot 20 years ago when I started out in this business. Today, unfortunately, it has become very difficult to do, in spite of what the politicians at FDA will have you believe. FDA has not made it any easier for the companies and the agency to communicate. I think, quite frankly, we've added way too many formalities into this entire process. I'll be honest with you, and I have to be a little careful what I say here, but because many of the reviewers in the agency are good personal friends of mine, some of them from when we were in graduate school together, we have very candid discussions, and my best regulatory discussions are not in government buildings, in White Oak or in Ottawa or someplace like that, but in the pubs surrounding the Beltway and the other areas. So it's become very unfortunate, God forbid you say, oh, let's get together. Oh, no, people just, they get paranoid. But, call me naive, and I think, a lot of people do. But I think the solution to most problems is more communication, not less. And then, last and certainly not least, is direct communication. There's no reason why you can't email or call a reviewer directly. Once again, they work for you. So 40% of their salary is being paid by your tax dollars, and 60% of their salary is being paid by your user fees. So either way you slice it, they work for you, right? So make them earn their living, right? Most importantly, as we're going to talk about this afternoon, there is no bigger fan of communication with the agency than I am. I will communicate with the FDA, or any regulatory agency for that matter, a hell of a lot more frequently than any regulation would ever require me to do. However, there's a big caveat to that. As an FDA consultant myself, it's amazing to me how many people I see walk into the agency and basically ask FDA, what do we do? I think that has disaster written all over it in every language for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not their job to tell you what to do. It's your job to figure out what to do, what makes sense from the engineering and the biology perspective, and then you go to the FDA and you sell it to them. And another reason why it's such a terrible strategy when you ask them what to do is because you're opening up a Pandora's box and you have no idea what you're going to get in return. If you ask them a question like, do I need to do a clinical trial? What do you think they're going to say? Of course you have to do a clinical trial, and you have to use 800 million patients. So on one hand, there's no bigger fan of communication with the agency than I am. But there's a caveat, and that brings me to one of my regulatory mantras. For those of you that have heard any of my podcasts or read any of my columns, you've probably heard this before. Lead, don't follow, tell, don't ask. In other words, go down to the agency, say, here's my device, this is the way that it works, this is my regulatory strategy, it's a 510K, and here's why, it's a de novo, and here's why, it's a PMA, and here's why. This is the testing that I've done thus far. This is the testing that I'm going to be doing next, and so on. And I don't even end my presentations by asking reviewers if they have a question, because believe me, if there are reviewers in the room and they have questions, they will ask them. That's their job, right? So tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. Very powerful strategy. Okay, now let's focus on the particular form of communication that we're talking about this afternoon, and that is the pre-submission process. What is it? And most importantly, why should we use it? I mentioned a moment ago, it can be your best friend. It can also be your worst nightmare, right? Here's, let me go off on a quick tangent. So most pre-subs today are unsuccessful. The question is, how do we define a successful pre-sub meeting? Well, to me, a successful pre-sub meeting is when everybody walks out of the room agreeing with me. That is my definition of a successful pre-sub meeting. By that definition, by that criteria, the vast majority, I would say probably 80% or more of pre-sub meetings are unsuccessful. Because, as we'll talk about, people are just not prepared. That's a different issue. But why should we use or consider using a pre-submission meeting? Because after all, it's not required. I usually recommend it more often than not, but it's certainly not required. Well, let's ask the question a slightly different way. What's the most common reason, or what an engineer would call the root cause of virtually all delays, warning letters, recalls, and so on? It's not communicating effectively. And the pre-sub is a good tool for that. By the way, one thing I've learned about communication is just because two people are talking doesn't mean that they're communicating with one another. I don't know how many of you guys in the room are married. But one thing I've learned is I can say one thing, and my wife can hear something completely different. Some of you are laughing, so I guess I'm not the only one, right? Well, a lot of people understand that that's true between a husband and wife, but a lot of people don't seem to get that exactly the same is true between the company and the FDA. The company can be saying one thing, and the FDA can be hearing something completely different, right? This happens a lot. So just because two people are talking, just because your company is presenting information doesn't mean that it's the same that FDA is hearing. A little later in the presentation, I'll give you some suggestions on how we can measure the efficacy of our communication strategy. You're used to thinking about measuring the efficacy of your device, but rarely, if ever, do I hear anybody measuring the efficacy of your communication. And the example I'll share with you is the device description. So here's some pretty humbling statistics for you. What percent of submissions are kicked back or rejected by the FDA first time out of the box? Well, they're pretty bad. About 75% of 510Ks are rejected first time out of the box. Of those rejections, about 85% are rejected specifically because of substantial equivalence or the lack thereof. I find, and for those of you that are working on the PMA side of the world, it's even higher than that. About 85% of PMAs are rejected first time out of the box. They result in what's called a major deficiency letter. I find that appalling. I find that embarrassing as an industry. We have devolved, not evolved, but devolved to the point where we're treating the FDA as our elementary school teacher. Here's my homework assignment. Will you please mark it up and give it back to me? I'm sorry, maybe I'm getting old. I started out in this business, over 25 years ago. That's not the game. That's not the way this game was always played. But that's not the way this is supposed to be, right? So one of the, and by the way, 510Ks and substantial equivalence is obviously a topic for a different discussion. But there is no reason why any 510K ever should get rejected because of substantial equivalence. It is such an amateur mistake, and this might seem harsh to some of you, but I see sometimes from the largest medical device companies on earth, they announce their 510K was just rejected, it was not substantially equivalent. I gotta just laugh, because this is such an easy problem to avoid, right? With advanced communication with the agency. So don't treat the FDA as your school teacher. Should we be proud of this? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. So my goal, I hear a lot of my regulatory friends, they say their goal is to get their 510K cleared, their de novo granted, their PMA approved, whatever. That has never been my goal. Because, quite frankly, any monkey can do that. My goal is to get my 510K cleared, my de novo granted, my PMA approved, ideally first time out of the box if I can. If I can't, with the minimum number of ping pongs of Q&A going back and forth. Right? Am I successful 100% of the time? No, but I can tell you I'm in the 20%, not in the 80%. And there's a lot of secret ingredients that go into my special sauce, but the most important to achieve that is advanced communication with the agency. I think anybody that goes to the agency the first time with their actual submission, in rare circumstances, that's a huge mistake. The regulatory risk that you're taking is almost incalculable. It's just amazing. So my goal is to get my clearance or granted or approval ideally first time, or with the minimum number of questions and answers going back and forth. And I set the bar very high. I won't apologize for that. I say it very simply. If I get a submission kicked back to me with any questions, I view that as a failure. 100% failure. Because I work really hard to get my questions, the questions answered in advance of the submission, such that once the submission goes in, assuming that the data shows what you think it's going to show, now it's just a matter of working through the system. People put their John Hancocks on it, and you're done. Right? Now, again, if we set that criteria as the bar for this industry, the failure rate would probably be 99%, if not higher. But simply put, we can do better. And how do we achieve this? And by the way, if anybody is interested, you can go to the Medufa website as part of the several versions of Medufa ago. FDA is required to update the statistics quarterly, so you can confirm the statistics that I just shared with you. They change a little bit from quarter to quarter, but not very much. I'm a big fan of the old Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. So you can go and see what the statistics are. Okay, another question that a lot of people ask me with regard to the pre-sub is how early in the product development life cycle should we go to the FDA and communicate with the form of a pre-sub or something else? Well, on one hand, I have sort of a schizophrenic response. On one hand, I say as early as possible. It's not too early. 1 nanosecond after you come up with the idea for your device is not too soon. On the other hand, you don't want to go 1 day sooner than you're ready. What do I mean by that, you're ready? I don't mean that you're just able to present your plan. I mean that you're able to rigorously defend your plan, and not just what you're going to do, But you also need to defend what you are not going to do and why you're not going to do it. I can give you a litany of examples, but suffice it to say, going to the FDA as early as you can is a huge advantage. I've got several companies that I've gone to the FDA as a pre-sub where the company didn't even have a prototype yet. I mean, literally, not a prototype. I've created what I call, FDA doesn't recognize this phrase, but it's what I call a pre-sub light. And the question is, why did those companies, these are obviously very early stage startups and entrepreneurs, why did they want to go to the FDA so soon? Anybody want to speculate? Why did they want to do that? Yes, ma'am?
Investor milestone?
Bingo. Because then they can go to their potential investors. What's your first name, ma'am?
Sabrina.
Sabrina, very good, Sabrina. Then they can go to their potential investors and say, look, we've already had a meeting with the FDA. Yes, things can change, but this is what we have agreed on. We need to do this, this, and this. This is how long each step is going to take. This is how much each step is going to cost. I don't know about you, and I work with doing regulatory due diligence for several angel and VC groups. That adds a lot of credibility to that kind of a discussion, because you can go out there and say, well, I'm going to bring my device out to the market as a 510K. You can talk about this from now until the sun burns out, but until you take it to the agency and sell it to them, it's pure theory. It's purely hypothetical. Right? So there's a lot of different reasons why people might want to go to the agency to communicate in the form of a pre-sub. And as I hinted at a moment ago, I personally think, in most cases, perhaps not all cases, but in the vast majority of cases, if the first time that you go to the agency is with your actual submission, that's a huge mistake. So my mantra, if I haven't bit you, but I hit you over the head with this enough, is tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow, and learn, don't bash. There's way too much bashing of the FDA that goes on in this business. You know, I will, as one of my friends who was a senior reviewer at the agency was fond of saying, physicians can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. And quite frankly, that's something that more people in this industry need to appreciate. Right? I think it's again, going off on a tiny bit of a tangent here, I think it's become a convenient excuse to use regulation to justify not just what we do, but also what we don't do. One of the cool things about my job is I get to walk into lots of different companies, and I go into, for example, the R&D or manufacturing, whatever, and I see they're doing a particular test, and I'll ask them, why are you doing this test? And more often than not, they'll say to me, well, because somebody, FDA tells us we have to. I say, all right, fair enough. If FDA didn't tell you you had to do that test, would you do it? Absolutely not. It provides absolutely no useful data. On the other hand, I walk into those same companies and I see they're not doing a particular test that I, as a professional biomedical engineer, think they should be doing. And I ask them, why are you not doing it? They say, because nobody tells us that we have to. Regulation, regrettably, has become a convenient excuse for this industry to hide behind. And that is a mistake. I believe, and this is one of the many differences in my approach to regulatory affairs and regulatory strategies, is to do what makes sense from an engineering and a biology perspective, and then to bring in the regulation after that. Everything needs to be predicated on the biology and the engineering. Okay, so further into the to the pre-sub process. So what is the pre-sub process? Well, it's basically just 3 steps, or is it? The pre-sub can be your best friend. It also can be your worst nightmare. It's totally up to you. So how does the process work, and what can you expect? Well, let's start out with what's required. It's only 3 requirements. Make the request, give them some information, and this is the one that causes my blood pressure to go up, ask them some questions. Make the request, say we want to have a meeting. You can do it either via teleconference or in person. 99.999 times out of 100. My recommendation for first contact with the agency is to do it in person, not via teleconference. Yes, I know it's a little more expensive. I know it's a little more logistically challenging, but I got a call from somebody who did a pre-sub meeting with the FDA via teleconference, and then they brought me in afterwards to clean up the mess. And I asked them, how did their pre-sub meeting go? And this was their VP of regulatory, and he described it in one word. He said, horrific. It was an absolute disaster. And this is why they asked me to come in after the fact to help them clean up the mess, right? So simply put, call me old-fashioned, but for the first point of contact, I think it should be face-to-face. Why? It's very simple. Because my most important objectives of a pre-sub are 2. It has nothing to do with the device. It has nothing to do with your regulatory strategy, your testing, whether or not you have to do clinical trials. It has nothing to do with any of that. My 2 objectives are as follows. First of all, establish a really good relationship with the reviewers, especially the lead reviewer. And second of all, demonstrate to my friends on the other side of the table that I know what the heck that I'm doing, right? Yes, I'll entertain their questions and their suggestions, but at the end of the day, this is my party, not theirs, right? It's important to remember who's in control. Yes, sir, please.
Is there any guarantee that those same individuals will be the ones that are going to be getting your, when you do the paper submission or the electronic copy submission?
Great question. What's your first name, sir?
Dallas.
Dallas. So the question was, is there any guarantee that the people that you meet in the pre-sub will be the same people that are reviewing your submission? Is that essentially your question? People might leave the agency. God forbid somebody walks out the door and gets hit by a bus, right? So things do change. But for the most part, Dallas, depending on how comprehensive your pre-sub meeting is, some of the people that are going to be reviewing your submission are probably going to be in the pre-sub. Is it all of them? I doubt it, but some of them will be. But actually, give me an opportunity to share with you another pre-sub story. So we did a pre-sub meeting, went very well. At the end of the meeting, the woman who I thought was going to be the lead reviewer announced that she was moving to a different part of the agency and we would be having a new lead reviewer in a few weeks. I was livid. I mean, if they would have told me that in advance, that, hey, I'm switching, we're going to have a new lead, I said, no problem, we'll wait a couple of weeks, we'll have the meeting then, because now we have just wasted a ton of time and money presenting this information and building a relationship, and now we have to start it all over again with somebody new. Now, to be fair, the politicians at FDA will say, it doesn't matter what reviewer you get because they're all following the same regulation the same way. Well, Dallas, you're laughing, so you appreciate my, not so sort of use of humor. With all due respect, bull, you know what? I mean, it simply doesn't make any sense. I can take the same piece of paper with words and give it to 10 different people and get 10 drastically different interpretations. So I believe in treating other people as professionals. I also want that same respect in return. So, does that answer your question, Dallas?
Yeah, so there's something there that, like, they've been tagged or something like, oh, I was in that meeting, or there's some way that they can kind of, go back to that. I'm assuming. Well,
we'll talk about it in a little while, there are meeting notes that we generate as a result of that meeting. But one thing that is important to remember, Dallas, and this is perhaps one of the biggest criticisms that a lot of people have of the pre-sub process, is nothing is binding. Nothing that the FDA says is binding, nothing that I say is binding, right? So that street runs in two directions. But I think, personally, most people focus on that too much. That doesn't bother me, because things do change, and they're supposed to change if they change for the right reasons. And let's be honest, nothing is ever binding, right? Even if you get a 510K, that can be undone, right? That's called a rescission, right? It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So nothing is forever. So anyway, the 3 steps of the process. Thank you, Dallas. Great questions. Make the request, provide information, and ask questions. And let me talk about the question for just a second, because it violates one of my all-time cardinal rules of dealing with the FDA, and that is never, ever, ever, ever ask FDA a question, right? But in order to get a pre-sub meeting with the FDA, this is one of the hoops they've created. And to be honest with you, I'm getting a little older, so I just tend to say what I think. I think the reason why the FDA put this in there is because they want to be a little condescending. They want to try to, think that they're the teacher. I mean, why do I have to go to the FDA and ask them questions? That to me doesn't make any sense, right? I should know a heck of a lot more about my device than the FDA ever does. And by the way, if you ever find yourself in the reverse, if the FDA knows more about your product than you do, that's a humongous problem. Right? So you should know a heck of a lot more, but unfortunately the only way that you're going to qualify for a meeting is to ask them some questions. So here's my solution to that sort of enigma, if you will, and that is I ask these questions, I phrase these questions as an attorney would call in the form of a leading question, such that the only answer that FDA can come up with is the answer that I want them to come up with. Suffice it to say, there are a number of questions that FDA provides as examples in the guidance document. I would never in a million years use any of them, okay? So, and that's a topic of a different discussion, but ask your questions in the form of a leading question. And in terms of the middle part, what information do we provide? Well, again, this is a very commonsensical kind of a question. We have to give the FDA enough information about our device, about the technology, about the procedure, about the regulatory strategy, about the testing and so on, to sit down and have an intelligent conversation. So, in terms of what information that you should provide, here's the litmus test. Every single sentence, every single word that goes into your pre-submission package, which is what I call the pre-submission package, should be in there for one reason only. And that is to help FDA come to the answer to whatever answer that you want to in that particular leading question. Right? Every single thing in your pre-sub package should be put in there for that particular reason. Okay? So digging into the pre-sub process, this is now going well beyond the mechanics. The mechanics you can read in the guidance, I mean, that bores me. Right? But going well beyond the mechanics, this is the poker game. How do you actually win the game? So what happens before the meeting? You make the, well, first of all, you put together your package and you send that with your meeting request. Again, I'm not going to get into the mechanics of how you do this, but that's in the guidance. You basically just need a cover letter and you need a bunch of other stuff that goes in there. Another thing, very important thing about the pre-sub that you should understand. I'm sorry? Another important thing about the pre-sub that you should understand is, unlike regulatory submissions, unlike a 510K or a de novo or a PMA or an HDE, where FDA says, this is the content that we expect to see, this is the format that we expect to see it in, the pre-sub is absolutely nothing like that. The content of the pre-sub is 100% up to you. It has nothing to do with the FDA. You tell the FDA what you want to talk about. You can also tell the FDA what you don't want to talk about. And if we have time, I'll talk about why I do that in a moment, right? You can follow the sort of the suggested sections if you want to in the guidance, but remember, guidance is only guidance. You don't have to. And there's a lot of things in there that they suggest that to me don't make any sense. Okay, so the content is 100% up to you. The second phase is the actual meeting itself. Now, again, my recommendation most of the time is to have a physical meeting down in White Oak. But if you don't want to do that, if you're not able to do that, you can do it via teleconference. I divide the meeting into two sections, the presentation portion of it and the negotiation portion of it. So a typical meeting, you'll get 60 minutes on paper. In reality, you're only going to have probably about 50 or maybe even 45 minutes by the time people get in and get settled and blah, blah, blah. You can ask for more. In some cases, I've asked for 2 hours. Sometimes you don't get it. You know, one of the most important lessons I learned as a graduate student was you don't get it if you don't ask. Just 1 second, Dallas. In a couple of cases, I asked for 2 hours. They gave me 90 minutes. In one case, I asked for 2 hours. They gave me 90 minutes. They stayed for 2.5 hours. Okay, so it depends on the meeting. And by the way, let me just tell one more story, Dallas, if you don't mind, and then I'll come back to your question. Recently, I did a pre-sub meeting with a company. A couple days before the meeting, I got a call from the lead reviewer. He said, Mike, just want to let you know, heads up that there's a room change for the meeting coming up in a couple days. I said, fine, no problem, just out of curiosity, why are you letting me know? And he said, because we've had way too many people that want to come to this meeting, and as a result, we're going to have it in one of our auditoriums. This happens to be a nanotechnology product that I'm involved with, something that the agency has not seen anything before. And so, you know, from a scientific and engineering perspective, a lot of people are really curious. I said, well, that's wonderful, but let me suggest this. I said, we want to keep our pre-sub meeting small and focused, because we need, you know, we have a job to get done. But we're going to be down there anyway. We're happy to do, I'm dating myself here, sort of a Mr. Wizard or a Bill Nye the Science Guy, a lunch and learn, where we can do a demo of the technology. And we had a couple of hundred people from the agency show up to see this. So at the end of the day, I have no problem doing that. But first and foremost, we got to get the job done. Dallas, please, you were going to ask a question. Okay.
I was going to ask if the difference in getting in, you know, on their phone call schedule versus getting in the person schedule. Is there, you know, the turnaround times and also, you know, the availability?
Good question. Again, for those of you that didn't hear, the question is phone call versus face-to-face meeting. Is there a difference in time? Well, let me preface my response by saying the numbers that you read in this guidance or any guidance in terms of, you know, FDA is supposed to have this within a certain days or whatever it is, take all of those numbers with a huge grain of salt. Because they're, I don't want to say they're pure fiction, but they're almost pure fiction. That said, here's my real-world evidence experience, RWE experience. So for a physical meeting, if we were submitting our pre-sub package today for a physical meeting, we could expect to have that meeting ideally in about 6 weeks, maybe at most about 8 weeks, something in that neighborhood. I wish I could tell you it was faster than that, but we are dealing with our U.S. government here, not exactly known for their efficiency. But on the other hand, I think 6 weeks is a decent, you know, a decent time. In terms of the phone, it's probably going to be a bit shorter than that, but not significantly, because it's still just a matter of logistics. I mean, on the FDA side of the equation, whether they're having a face-to-face meeting or a phone meeting, it really doesn't matter, because they're going to be all probably in the same room on the conference call, right? So some of them might be remote, and I'll give you, Dallas, another reason why I'm not keen on having phone meetings. We had a teleconference with FDA, and there were a few minutes where it was silent. We thought maybe we lost the connection. We were going to hang up and dial back in. Well, it turned out that they had us on mute, and they were having a conversation, unbeknownst to us. You're laughing, Dallas, but I was livid, because in a face-to-face meeting, that would not happen. This is a poker game, that would be the equivalent of like taking your cards out into the hallway with you or something, that just doesn't fly. Yes, sir.
Earlier you said that some companies have gone into a pre-sub even as early as a concept phase.
Yep. Yep.
But what you present in that meeting will drive the quality of the conversation.
Correct.
And if you go in with just a concept, you're going to get similar feedback. But if you're further along,
yes and no. So, what's your first name?
Karan.
Karan. So again, for the benefit of those in the back, the question is, if we're going in very early with just a concept, maybe a prototype, or maybe not even a prototype yet, I think what you're asking is sort of what's the how do we handle that? How do we? Well, so here's the way that I do this, and I've done this successfully now a number of times. It's what I call a pre-sub light. We have to be very honest with the agencies. We have to say, look, this is a device still under development. As a matter of fact, we're very, very early in the development stage. Maybe we don't even have a prototype. Maybe it's just a concept. But for the purpose of our discussion, assuming that we're able to design a device that does X, Y, and Z, if we can make that assumption, and granted it's a big assumption, can we agree that the regulatory pathway is 510K or de novo or whatever it is? Can we agree that classification is? Can we agree that the product code is, yada, yada, yada? So if you put some caveats onto that, then it's a doable thing. Does that make sense? Again, I'll share with you, Karan, another real-life example. Do you like these kind of real-life examples? I think it's better than the theory. So you have to be prepared to do what you say. So I had a company from a different country come to me last year. Let's just say that they were not in the best of light with the FDA. They had some significant problems with the FDA, and they asked me to come in and help clean up the mess, which is often the case. And just before we went to the agency, I said to the company, I just want to make sure that all of the things that we're going to tell the agency we're going to do, you're prepared to do. And they said, yes, Mike, absolutely. If you can, make this go away, we'll do, all these things. So I said, okay, fine. So we went to the agency. We ate a little humble pie. We said, yes, mistakes were made in the past, but we have a new team in town, and here's what we're going to do. FDA said, okay, fine, no problem. We'll let bygones be bygones. Well, long story short, a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the company. They said, Mike, we changed our mind. We're not going to do these things that we said we were going to do. I was livid. I have a home office that I work from part-time. My wife happened to be home at the time. I was just about screaming on the phone. I said, look, you want to do this, that's fine. That's a business decision. You find yourself a new regulatory consultant. Because the last thing that I want to happen is when I go into the agency next, perhaps with your company, people are saying, oh, there's that Drues guy. He promised us that he would do X, Y, Z before, and then he's not doing it. Right? So I joke about this. I say, it's a poker game, it's a chess game, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, this is high-stakes bingo. And in some cases, we are talking about playing with people's lives here. That is something that none of us should forget. Good question. Thank you. Continuing on. So what happens during the meeting? So there's the presentation portion, and then there's the negotiation portion. The presentation, and assuming we're going to have a 60-minute meeting, what I really like to do is limit the presentation to about 15 or 20 minutes. I want to make sure that I reserve the 30 or maybe even 40 minutes, if possible, for the most important part of the meeting, which is the negotiation. Because the presentation, for the most part, is nothing more than a quick summary, a synopsis of what you've already presented to them in your pre-sub package. Now, some people say to me, Mike, well, why do we need to waste valuable meeting time telling FDA what they already know? I agree with them. However, one thing I've learned is it's not just my graduate students that don't always read what I ask them to read. The simple reality is many of my FDA reviewer friends will admit to me privately, they will never say this in public, that they just don't view the pre-sub process as critical, for example, as reviewing a final submission. And to a certain extent, I can understand the logic of that. But on the other hand, we as companies, we're spending a lot of time and money getting prepared. The least I can expect is for my friends on the other side of the table to do their homework as well. As a matter of fact, I have to be a little careful what I say here. I love to create links in my pre-sub or any submission to videos and have the reviewer watch a video. Well, there are ways that you can keep track of who watches your video and who doesn't, and if they watch it more than once, and if they watch certain parts of it over and over again. And I've been in several situations where a reviewer will ask a question that I know it was answered in the video, and I also know going into the meeting that that reviewer didn't watch the video. I will call them out on that. I will say, well, that was presented in our video. Maybe you must have missed that part of it or something like that. Okay? So, again, I expect to be treated as a professional, but I want that in streets to run two directions. The most important part of the meeting is the negotiation. And this is why the vast majority of pre-sub meetings are not successful. Remember, my definition of a successful pre-sub meeting is when everybody walks out of the room agreeing with us. Okay? So, what does the negotiation mean? Well, if you go to the FDA and say, here's what we're going to do. FDA says, nice try, but there ain't a snowball's chance, and you know where that's going to be enough. You need to do more. What do? Most companies in that scenario, they'll say one of two things. They'll be just like in a deer in the headlights. I don't know. Or they'll say, well, we'll take your comment under consideration, and we'll get back to you. The problem with doing that is now you're talking about weeks, probably months of delay. Or the worst thing is they start to get desperate and throw things out willy-nilly. Suffice it to say, I don't want to be in any of those situations, right? So before going to the FDA with my pre-sub, I will go through and I will put my FDA reviewer hat on, and I will ask what questions, what concerns would I have? In other words, if this particular testing is not enough, if my clinical trial is not enough, what can I offer up as a negotiation if I have to? As I said, I view this entire relationship as a poker game between the company and the FDA in every sense of the word. And using that poker metaphor a step further, when I go to the agency, I have 3 sets of cards in my pocket. The first set of cards are cards that I put down on the table prophylactically without anybody even asking me. Here's what we're going to do. The second set of cards I keep in my pocket and only will play if I have to. If I say I'm going to do a clinical trial, pick a number, with 20 people, and the FDA says, oh, gee, that's not really enough, I'll have a card in my pocket. In other words, one of my backup slides for my PowerPoint. And this is why, in spite of FDA's insistence, I never submit my PowerPoint to the agency in advance of my submission, even though they ask for it all the time. It's guidance. You don't have to do it, right? So I bring it in there with me because I will have my backup slides in my PowerPoint, and the last thing that I want to do is share my backup slides with the agency, right? So I'll have a backup slide with a slightly more robust clinical trial design, maybe a higher statistical power, maybe different endpoints, maybe different inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so on. And then the third set of cards that I have are cards that I cannot play even if I want to. Maybe the company doesn't have the resources to do it, maybe the technology doesn't exist in order to do it. So 3 sets of cards. The first set I put down on the table prophylactically. The second set I keep in my pocket and use only if I have to. And the third set I have to keep in my pocket forever. I can never use them. And finally, phase 3, not in the drug but phase 3 of this process is what happens after the meeting. Well, within 15 calendar days, not business days, calendar days, we are supposed to submit our meeting notes. Why it's calendar days and not business days, don't even get me started, but within 15 calendar days, we're supposed to submit our meeting notes. Now again, I'll share with you another situation I was in. We had a pre-sub meeting. We submitted our meeting notes within the 15 calendar day window. FDA took 2 months to get back to us with their response to our meeting notes. Long story short, they were contesting them, and they said, you have 15 days to get back to us. Otherwise, our version of the meeting notes goes what's into the record. I said, I'm sorry, this is not a fair game, right? You took 2 months to get back to me. I'm perfectly happy to get back to you, but I can't get back to you in 15 days to adequately address these things, right? So, again, I expect to be treated with respect. I expect to treat other people with respect. And just because something happens, something is in some guidance, think about it this way. We're not talking about a product that's on the market that's causing harm to people, where days or even minutes matter. We're talking about meeting notes from a pre-sub meeting, right? That makes absolutely no sense to me. You can push back. So what do you put in your meeting notes? Again, this is where I go well beyond the regulation. Most people, one second, sir. Most people think of the meeting notes as nothing more than a redaction of what happened in the meeting. He said, she said, he said kind of a thing. I don't look at meeting notes that way at all. I write meeting notes very, very strategically to try to avoid problems later on. And by the way, I don't take a literal interpretation of the phrase meeting notes. I will also use the meeting notes as a forum to inject things that were not talked about in the meeting. In other words, you have to be very clear that you're doing this. You have to say, it was not explicitly discussed in the meeting, however, it is the company's position that, ... Okay? As long as you cover your you-know-what, I have absolutely no problem doing that. Right? Do we really need regulation defining what the phrase meeting notes mean? I hope not. Sir, in the back, you had a question, please.
I was wondering what the result of the pushback was.
In that particular case, it's still pending. So this is one of the cases where I've only had to do this twice in the past. We may end up going to the Ombudsman's office because this has to be a fair game for both sides. Right? So ask me maybe in a month or two. Hopefully I'll have an answer.
The same thing happened to us, that's all.
Yeah, good question. All right, so that's the meeting notes. And if there's a disagreement or a dispute, you can dispute that. One second. But as I've learned from being married, you have to pick your battles. Certain things are worth fighting over, other things are not. Right? So many, many times, for example, I've been in situations where the regulation requires us to do a particular test. And I'll go in as a professional biomedical engineer and say, this test is unnecessary. I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in the area of biomaterials, and I do this a lot in biocompatibility testing. And I'll say this test is unnecessary. And more often than not, the FDA will say, okay, that makes sense, no problem. But in some cases, and I had one case in particular where FDA was asking the company to do some very sophisticated biocompatibility testing that, in my opinion, as a professional biomedical engineer, was not justified. And if they did the test, it would probably take 6 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. That's when we did draw a line in the sand and say, this is not, we don't need to do this, and here are the reasons why. On the other hand, sometimes we'll get asked to do a test, and as a professional biomedical engineer, I think the test is not necessary. But if it's the kind of thing that we can do in a couple of days for a couple of bucks, I will often say to the company, you know what, it's not necessary to do, but it's an easy thing to do, so why don't you just do it and save our political capital for a battle worth fighting over later, in the future. Right? So, just like being married, you have to pick your battles. Doubs, please. You're going to get your money's worth today.
That's okay. 2 questions. First is, what, tags this potential pool of people to be in that room with you? And secondly, how many people would be in the room? Maybe you can answer the first one quicker.
Good question. So 2 questions. So how does FDA determine which people are in the meeting from their side of the table? And the second one was?
How many people?
How many people? So let me answer the second question first. How many people? Well, as I also learned from my wife, oftentimes less is more. So I want to have exactly the number of people that I need in that meeting, but not one person more. And actually, those 2 questions, Dallas, are directly related. This comes back to the meeting agenda. Most people look at the meeting agenda only as what we're going to talk about. I also look at the meeting agenda as an opportunity to tell FDA what we're not going to talk about. So, for example, if I'm not planning on talking about human factors or ergonomics, I will say on the agenda, obviously human factors is important, but because our device is early in development, we haven't gotten to that point yet, so human factors will not be discussed in this meeting. What that does is that says to the FDA, you don't have to bother inviting an HF person. So I want to control the room as much as possible. Even as an outsider, I still have a lot of control over who's in that meeting. So short answer, Dallas, I want to have as few people as possible. I don't want to have too few. I also sometimes think that it's sort of a bit of a game. FDA likes to make sure they have at least the same number, if not more, people in the room as the company does. I had a company come to me at the last minute. They were doing a pre-sub meeting in about 2 weeks, and they asked me to help. And unfortunately, I already was scheduled to be at the FDA that day with another meeting, so I couldn't. But they told me about it, and long story short, they had about 18 meeting objectives, pre-sub questions. And between the company and the FDA, there were 50 people that were going to attend this meeting. I said to them in advance, I said, this is disastrous. You do not want to have this meeting. They said, oh, no, Mike, we're going to do it, blah, blah. I said, okay, fine. You do what you want. Well, long story short, the night of the meeting, after the meeting, a few hours later, I got several emails and one phone call from people in the company, Mike, this was disaster, we should have listened to you. But I guess it was good for me because now I got a lot more business to clean up after this mess, right? So, what can you say? Yes, ma'am.
So, leading to the questions, they say, like when you train your dog, you go to a trainer, they're more training the owner than the dog.
I don't have a dog, but it makes sense.
What percentage is you more training also the people in the company, you're educating them on what is acceptable, what's not, versus, what percentage of your success would you say education of company, consulting the company on what to do and what not to do versus...
That's a great question. What's your first name?
Michelle.
Michelle, that's a great question, Michelle. I spend a lot of time working in advance with the company, educating them about this process, some of the things that we're talking about today. I personally believe, perhaps like your dog, your owner-dog metaphor, because the better the people in the company understand, not just what the guidance says, they can read that, but the whole game, the strategy, the more effective the entire team can be. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. And that's why, if you're working in a company that has in-house regulatory folks, they should be educating the rest of the team. If your in-house regulatory folks don't have the pre-sub experience to do that, and there's nothing wrong with that, then you need to maybe look outside for somebody, me or somebody else that can help. And one other thing, follow up to Dallas's question about who to bring to the meeting. Sometimes companies ask me, well, should we bring our lawyer to the pre-sub meeting? And I usually say, absolutely not. How come? Because, I'm sorry?
You're going to show... You're going to extra protect.
Well, perhaps, but here's the way I look at it. Once one side lawyers up, then the other side has to lawyer up. And now when you get a whole room full of lawyers, now nobody wins. Call me naive, but as a biomedical engineer, this discussion should be predicated on two things, on engineering and biology, and to a lesser extent on regulation. Okay? It's not about the legalities. If you are worried about legalities, that's a whole other set of issues. Right? So you want to bring your lawyer, that's up to you. Don't get me started about, lawyers working in regulatory. That's a different issue. But
so true.
Well, hold on. To be fair, because I don't want to throw all lawyers under the bus, I'll only throw a few lawyers under the bus. If you have lawyers working in regulatory that have a biological, medical, or engineering background, I have no problem with that.
Of course.
If, on the other hand, you have lawyers who, went to law school, but they know nothing about engineering or biology, and they're just reading, whoa, here's what the regulation says, why are we having this discussion?
And they charge you $500.
Oh, well, that's...
Maybe
I won't tell you what I charged. Yes, sir.
What about the lawyers that have been FDA and now they're lawyers?
Yeah. Because we have one of those.
I'll leave it as rhetorical now. So, okay, let's continue on. I've got lots more suggestions on the meeting notes, but I think I'm going to skip that. In terms of the guidance, so here's the progression of pre-sub guidance. The original draft guidance was issued in 2012. That was followed a couple of years later in 2014 by a final guidance. One would think that final means no more guidance, right? Well, just a couple of months ago, there was an updated final guidance in the end of last year, which kind of begs the question, what's next? Or more fundamentally, what the heck does draft or final mean in the context of guidance? I can't tell you how many times I get calls from companies, Mike, we've done everything that is said in the final guidance, and yet it doesn't seem to be enough. To quote a famous politician, I feel your pain, but why would anybody assume that final means final? There is no meaning to the words draft or final in the context of guidance or any regulation. All regulation is constantly evolving, constantly changing, as it should be. Right? So I don't care what's stamped in front, on the big cover, draft or final, whatever it is. It's totally meaningless. All of this is a work in progress. And I've said to FDA so many times, you shouldn't use these terms, draft and final, because you just confuse people. Right? But unfortunately, they continue to do it. Is there a user fee for the pre-sub process? Well, not yet, but give Congress a little bit of time. Some of you may know that the new user fees that went into effect last fall created some additional user fees. Most problematic to me is the de novo. I mean, the fact that the de novo user fee is 10 times larger than the 510K, I think is unconscionable. I think, Congress could not have created a bigger obstacle to creating truly new or novel devices than by imposing this kind of a user fee on the de novo. And at the same time, Congress could not have given even more of an incentive for companies, let's be honest, like yours in this room, to create products that we already have. The 510K is an incentive to mediocrity. It's an incentive to continue to bring out products that we already have. The de novo is something truly new or novel. At least it's supposed to be. And to create this kind of a user fee, to be clear, and for those that are interested, I did a couple of podcast interviews on this topic last fall when this came out. However, it should be comparable to the 510K user fee, not 10 times bigger. And if FDA really wanted to make some money, and by the way, this is not FDA, this is Congress, so let's be fair. It's Congress that has the problem here, not the FDA. If they wanted to really bring in some money, don't worry about the de novo, because last year there were less than 100 de novos that went through the agency, right? On the other hand, impose a modest user fee, maybe $1,000 or $2,500 for the pre-sub process. And I've actually taken a step further. When I was doing my MBA many years ago, one of my professors was fond of saying something very simple but also very profound. He said, if you want more of something, you create incentives. If you want less of something, you create disincentives. I don't want to use user fees as a penalty, as a cost of doing business. I want to use user fees to encourage people to do the right thing. So here's what I have suggested, and I was on Capitol Hill talking about this after this went into effect. I said, create a modest user fee for the pre-sub process, but for companies that choose to have a pre-sub before they make their submission, they don't pay the fee or they get that money back. For companies that don't want to have a pre-sub and make the submission anyway, they have to pay the user fee. Why? Because there is statistically a higher risk of having that submission rejected if you don't have the pre-sub, which means more work for the company, but also more work for the FDA. So let's use user fees not as a stick, but rather as a carrot. Right? Well, obviously that hasn't happened yet. I'm optimistic, call me naive, but I think the solution to most problems is more communication, not less. So here are a couple of other miscellaneous questions that I've gotten from the trenches. Just a couple of them. So do other parts of the world offer a pre-sub option? Well, some do, some don't, but you can always ask. And believe me, with the changes going on in Europe right now, they should do this. You could essentially do something like this with your notified body. There's a lot of copying and pasting. This is from the TGA in Australia that put out a guidance. Fancy that, they call it the same thing, a pre-submission meeting. Pure coincidence, right? Of all the things they call it the same thing that we call it, right? So they put out a guidance on it as well. But my suggestion, very, very simple. Even if they don't offer it, ask for it. If you don't get it if you don't ask, especially in Europe. Here's another question that I got from somebody a few months ago. Is it possible to request a pre-sub to discuss both a 510K and a de novo in the same pre-submission meeting? Well, the regulation doesn't say anything about this. The regulation shouldn't say anything about this. Anybody with an IQ of more than 5 should be able to think about this and come up with a solution. So what would be the answer to this question? Is it possible to request, and obviously it's possible to request it. The question is, would you want to have a pre-sub meeting to discuss both a 510K and a de novo at the same time? How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? How many of you don't know? How many are paying attention? How many would like to have $1 million if I had to give to you? The rest of you are here for just altruistic reasons.
Same product.
Well, yeah, same product.
Oh, okay.
Well, so let's drill into this a little bit more, because you can't answer this question yes or no. So here's some of the thinking. This is the regulatory logic. Is it two different devices, or is it the same device with two different indications? It's very possible, and I've done this many times, where one device for one indication is a 510K, exactly the same device for another indication is a de novo, right? So is that the scenario? Either way, my advice would not be to combine them. How come? Because you're going to add confusion. No matter how much you try to separate these two devices, you're going to add confusion. And one thing that I've learned in playing this game is it's hard enough to communicate. The last thing that you want to do is have multiple messages, right? So don't combine them. You're going to add confusion. Unless both devices or indications are the same, in other words, they're in the same clinical area, you're probably going to be dealing with two different groups of people at the FDA anyway. So it might not even be possible logistically to combine them. But assuming that you want to have an in-person meeting, which is my usual advice, you can certainly try to schedule them so that they're in the same day, maybe one in the morning, one in the afternoon. I probably wouldn't want to do it quite that day. What I would do is consecutive days. One on a Tuesday and the next one on a Wednesday or something like that. That way you have at least a little bit of time to kind of regroup routine meetings, and you minimize your travel costs. And by the way, I have said that to companies. I have said that to the FDA in the past. Hey, look, the company has got a couple of products we would like to combine so that we're not giving JetBlue Airlines more money than we have to or whatever it is, right? You can always ask. It's not a problem. and there might be other reasons as well. Are the results of a pre-submission meeting public? Well, this is an interesting question. Not so much from the FDA perspective, although I have to be really, really careful what I say here. It is theoretically possible to put in an FOI request, a Freedom of Information request, for pre-sub meeting notes, but you have to do it carefully. Okay? But it's not just the FDA that can tell you. Here's an example of a company that put out their own press release. This particular company announces a successful FDA meeting. They were referring to their pre-sub meeting. Right? If you want to do this, that's up to you. You could offer a press release. Do you want to do that? Should you do that? Well, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. Somebody asked me just recently, FDA asked for a video prior to the pre-sub. Should we send it? Well, first of all, as I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of using videos. But in this particular situation, we did not. So the FDA asked for a video. What would you say? Would you give the FDA a video in advance? And let's say also that this is a device that's still early in development. And let's say that you have some videos, but they're not necessarily Hollywood quality. They're maybe just videos of previous generations. What do you think? Would you give FDA the video?
A video of the prototype?
A video of the device being used, or maybe some testing methodology or something like that?
No.
Well, the short answer is probably not, at least not yet, because if you have a video that is capable of standing by itself, with good narration and so on, then I have absolutely no problem giving it to them, and in that case I would have said to the company in advance, let's give it to them. But on the other hand, and this is what the situation was here, if the video was, how do I want to say this? So, certain parts of the video were no longer current to the current generation of the design. What I said to the company was, let's bring the video in with us and show it during the meeting, and that way we can control the message. For example, we can mute what's being shared with the video via audio, and we can do our own voiceover, right? So I want to do everything that I can to control the message. But videos are very, very powerful. Let's take this a step further. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth 1,000 pictures, and a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So a lot of times the company will ask me, should we bring one of our physical devices into the meeting with us? What do you think of that? Yes. The shortest and most accurate and most succinct answer to every question in regulatory affairs is, it depends. It depends. Now again, I know this drives engineers and scientists nuts. I'm a PhD in engineering. I appreciate the mentality, but it depends. So what does it depend on? Well, what's the probability that the device doesn't work the way you plan it to work? I, as a consultant for FDA, have been in meetings where the company is trying to do a little Mr. Wizard kind of a thing, and they have their device in front of them, and let's just say the device is not cooperating the way they thought it was supposed to cooperate. Right? It's probably not a good situation to be in where, a couple feet on the other side of the table where all these FDA reviewers watching you futz around and trying to figure out, that's not a good situation. Instead, I come back to the video. I will show a video of our device in action. Why? Well, can I say this? You can shoot the video 25 times over again until you get the result that you want. Is that bias? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. I have even go so far as to one company, this was an electronic device, they said, Mike, we really want to bring our device to the meeting. I said, fine, no problem. I'm not the regulatory police. I will never tell you what you cannot do. I always focus on what you can do. So here's what I suggested to them. Bring the box, but just if somebody happens to forget putting the power cord in the suitcase, when they come to the agency, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. And that's exactly what they did. Because they brought out the box and they said, here's our device, but oh darn, we forgot the power cord, so we can't demonstrate it. But oh, by the way, we have this video that we'll show you that shows how this device works. You're laughing, you like that strategy? Would you use that? I will do everything that I can, legal of course, in order to win the game. Something to think about. Continuing on, beyond the pre-sub. Now let's, oh yes, sir, please, I'm sorry.
Just as you said earlier, there are certain things that you should exclude from the agenda, like ergonomics or industrial design.
Well, I was just using that as an example. You can exclude anything you want.
Yeah, but then if there's a risk in the video of bringing the actual device of actually exposing those things, I think that it would not be a good idea to do that.
Okay, say that one more time. I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
Let's say there's a medical device and you don't want to discuss ergonomics.
Okay.
In the video, you show it that somebody's wearing it. And
okay.
You're not there yet. So that's basically you're exposing those issues.
Okay.
People may have those questions.
Well, it's possible. It's an interesting scenario. Yeah, it's possible. Let me just be clear because I want to make sure that I'm misunderstood. I'm not saying, when I use that human factor example, I'm not saying that we will never talk about human factors, because that would be a huge mistake. In that kind of a scenario, I would say, well, the device is still very early in development, and therefore, we're not talking about human factors because we're still trying to figure out, to get the device working. But when we get to that, that bridge, we will come up with our human factor plan, and we will present it to you.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you showed a video in a meeting and where somebody was wearing it, then you're inviting questions.
Maybe, but again, so this is where the role of the facilitator or the moderator comes in. 60 minutes sounds like a long time. It is really not. And one of the most important jobs of the moderator, oftentimes I'm the moderator of the meeting, is to triage the questions as they come in. In other words, if somebody asks a question, because let's be honest, some of my friends at FDA are academics, and academics love to ask questions for no other reason than to ask a question. I'm not picking on academics. I teach, part-time graduate students and medical students. But it's the job of the moderator to decide which questions are important enough to spend some of your valuable meeting time talking about, in which questions you need to defer and push down the road and say, that's a wonderful question. It was already on our list, but thank you for reminding us of it. But because of our limited time, or more importantly, because it does not fit within the meeting objectives of today's meeting, we will follow up with you on that, after the meeting or something like that. It's important, say your first name again? Karam. It's very important, Karam, in my opinion anyway, to maintain control. Yes, sir.
So what if you're in the situation where you did a pre-submission a little bit too early and then you had a major design change?
Are you saying that's a good thing or a bad thing?
No, I'm saying, would you do another pre-sub?
Well, you could. That's a good question. What's your first name?
Talal.
That's a good question. Oftentimes people ask me, is the pre-sub a one-off thing? Can we only have one pre-sub and never anymore? Absolutely not. You can have as many pre-subs as you want. Most companies will only have one and then some follow-up discussion to that. I guess it depends on how major of a design change you're talking about. If it's a design change, and are we using the word design in an engineering sense where we're talking about the physical device?
Yeah.
Okay, so because we could also change the label if we're changing the indication, for example. Now, any discussion that we had before in terms of regulatory pathway, in terms of classification and risk and all that other, now that's all, out the door.
Yeah, a design change though closer to the predicate than what it was.
What you could do if you're making it closer to the predicate, and I as an engineer, it just makes me cringe, when I hear people say that kind of thing, because again, it's an incentive to mediocrity, to bring out products that we already have. It's copying, your neighbor's homework. Sure. But anyway, the point is, I would just go to the lead reviewer and I would say, hey, look, we don't have to do a formal pre-sub. Hey, look, we want to just give you a quick update that we're making the following design change. Here's the reason why. I hope you're going to come up with a better reason than making it closer to the predicate. But here's the reason why, and we're just letting you know as a matter of professional courtesy that this is what we're doing. You might be able to do that as a pre-sub supplement. You might be able to do that just informally. Once you set up a good relationship with your reviewers, especially the lead reviewer, that is going to come back to you in spades.
And the lead reviewer is the one who's emailing you back and forth?
Oftentimes. Although I also try to avoid the what do you call it, the telephone game, where you have multiple links in the chain. So if I have a statistics question or something, if I know who the statistician is, I will email them directly, but I'll also CC the lead reviewer. Kind of depends on the lead reviewer. Some people, they don't have a problem with that. Some people it's like, hey, I don't need to micromanage my team. They don't know what they're doing. Other people it's like, oh, no, I have to be in control of everything. So it depends on your lead reviewer. Good question. Yes, sir, please.
How do you handle proprietary information or non-disclosure?
What's your first name, sir?
Nitin.
Say it again?
Nitin.
Okay. Well, let me be brutally candid with you, if that's okay. If you have concerns about sharing proprietary information with the FDA, that's a concern to me right then and there. I mean, with all due respect, that's not the kind of game that I want to be playing. We need to be open and honest with the agency. That said, you can certainly mark on your pre-sub package, and in my pre-sub template, it's in the footer. contains confidential proprietary information, not for distribution outside FDA, something like that. Whether that's legally enforceable or not, who the heck knows? That's kind of like, what good is an NDA? I mean, one thing I've learned, I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV, but all of these agreements come down to one thing: the integrity of the two people, the two parties that enter into them. So if you want to put that standard disclaimer, as I often do, confidential, blah, 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 but, and I'm not sure if this is what you meant by your question or not, if you're concerned about sharing certain aspects of your technology with the agency for proprietary reasons, that starts to make me a little bit nervous. One of the reviewers is going to steal your idea, go out and start a company, and you know what I mean? Could it happen? I suppose it could happen, but may I ask, why are you asking that question?
No, it could be not necessarily just the idea, but somehow how this test was done, or something which may be something that could be shared throughout the industry or something.
Well, if it's a test methodology, sooner or later you're going to have to tell them, whether it's in a pre-sub or your final submission. I mean, if I was an FDA reviewer and I read your submission and you tested your device according to some test methodology that I've never heard of, or you've developed your own proprietary test methodology, that's fine. The first thing that I'm going to be asking you for are the details of your methodology. Because as an engineer, how can I possibly evaluate the results of your test if I don't understand how you did your test?
No, I'm not again sharing the information with them, but how do you prevent them or that getting spread throughout the industry?
I say the same thing. How do you prevent that with your own employees, right? How do you prevent your own employees from taking it, somewhere else or something? It's the same kind of situation. Good questions. Thank you. Anybody else before we continue on? All right, just a few. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, sir.
Yeah, I mean, the FDA is not meant to publish any non-public information, period. And there are people who want to do that.
Yeah.
I have a lot of experience is dealing with the practice of own companies. It's not in their interest, it's not our interest to do that. And if it's my mistake, you've got to share everything with them.
That's correct.
How can they approve a drug or a device you have to give them what information to?
That's correct. Thank you for adding that, sir. And one other thing, and I don't know if this is why you were asking this question or not, but I have had situations where companies say to me, Mike, do we really need to say this to the FDA? Do we really need them to tell them? And I don't know about other people in this room, that starts to make my radar go up, right? Because, again, that's not a game personally for me that I want to be playing. It's one thing to talk about spin. Is the bottle half empty or half full? Both are factually correct statements. You can't argue with either one, right? If I say the bottle is half empty, is that bias? Of course it is. If I say the bottle is half full, is that bias? Of course it is. So as a company, I'm going to spin the information in one direction. The FDA is going to spin it in another direction. I have no problem with that. But the scenario that I think you're possibly suggesting is, let's not show the FDA the bottle at all. That's the problem. Anyway, some other communication tips beyond just the pre-sub. So how can we communicate effectively? Well, as I hinted at earlier, talking or writing doesn't necessarily mean you're communicating. Test your message, the efficacy of your message, and the best example I can give you is the device description. The device description is, in my opinion, one of the most poorly written parts of any medical device submission. Why? For one reason. Because the vast majority of questions that I see coming back from reviewers are indicative of the fact that the reviewer does not understand our device, how it works, what it does, and so on. In my opinion, it is incumbent on us, it is our job to make sure FDA understands our device, not the other way around. So, to me, the device description is not working if they're asking questions about how your device works. So, how do you measure the efficacy of your device description? Very simple. Take your device description, give it to somebody who is not familiar with your device, ask them to read it, and then yank it out of their hands and ask them to describe to you what they just read. If they paint a verbal picture that looks similar to the device that you have under development, then you know you're communicating. If they paint a picture that looks nothing like what you have under development, or worse, if they're so confused that they can't paint a picture at all, you know you're not communicating. This is common sense. You shouldn't have to have an MD or a PhD or an RAC after your name to do this. Right? It shouldn't need to be in the regulation, and yet most people don't do this. And as I said earlier, post-submission questions means that you're not communicating effectively. Just because you're talking, just because you're having meetings, doesn't mean that you're communicating. I'm talking about communicating effectively. How can we measure the efficacy of your message? Here's another way. Don't treat the FDA as your beta tester. It amazes me how many companies, not just device, but drug companies as well, the first people outside of their company to see their submission is the FDA. To me, this makes absolutely no sense. Right? So one of the things that I do with some of the companies that I work with, I'm not trying to be self-serving, I'm just sharing with you some of my best practices that I've learned in playing this game now for almost 30 years, is before the company goes down to White Oak to sell whatever it is that they're trying to sell, they'll ask me to come in, put my FDA reviewer hat on temporarily, read through their submission, sit through their presentation, and if I can be a bit brash, bash the hell out of it. Because the idea is if they're going to make a mistake, better for them to make a mistake in front of me, what do I count? Than down in White Oak when it really matters. For those of you that are familiar with the design controls, this should sound not at all unfamiliar to you. What am I describing? The concept of the independent reviewer. Don't focus on what the regulation says. That is a huge mistake. Focus on the intent of the regulation, the philosophy of the regulation. We don't need more regulation. We've already got enough regulation. What we need is people understanding what the intent of the regulation is and then being able to apply it. So this is already in the regulation, not in a regulatory sense, more in an engineering sense, but we can apply it in the regulatory side the same way. Why would you assume that what you say you're right is what the audience hears? Again, as I've alluded to before, and my wife doesn't like it when I refer to her publicly, but some of my most important lessons to be learned about regulatory strategy and about communication have been from my marriage. Right? So I'm not going to say let's learn from our mistakes. let's learn from our experiences. How's that? I didn't say that. Here's the tagline from one of my favorite books. It's not what you say that matters, it's what people hear. It's not what you say that matters, it's what people hear. This is the true art, not the science, but the art of regulatory affairs. Mastering this skill, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. Certain politicians are very good at this, and we can be good at it as well. Something to be thinking about. Peter Drucker said the most important thing in communication is to hear what isn't being said. One of the things I've learned, and this is another reason why I like to have pre-sub meetings in person, is because, let's think about this for a second, they say that 70% of communication is nonverbal. And I actually think it's higher than that, which means that 70 or more % of my message is not being delivered by my words, but by my facial expressions, by my body language, by my vocal variety, and so on and so on. Right? When you're communicating over the telephone, or worse, when you're communicating in writing via email, all of that is lost. I will purposely inject things into a pre-sub meeting, sometimes just to kind of see how people respond. And even if they don't say anything verbally, if people start shifting around on their chairs, that to me is, speaks louder than words. And by the way, I'll share with you another quick example, and we're going to wrap this up so we can have some more Q&A. I did a pre-sub meeting at FDA, and at the end of the presentation, we wanted to have a discussion. Suffice it to say, nobody in the FDA side of the table was saying anything. I mean, I could hear the crickets. I got so frustrated, I said, look, I want to avoid a situation, everybody's in a room, we have a captive audience. If you have questions, if you have concerns, bring them on, let's talk about them. Because what I want to avoid is a scenario where a month from now, we get an email with 65 questions. That's ridiculous. Nobody wanted to say a darn thing. So I got so frustrated, I said, look, we want to have a discussion, but one of the underlying assumptions of the word discussion is that there's more than one person talking. Again, not everybody appreciates my not-so-subtle use of humor, but I will do whatever I can to make this process work. Okay? So what's the message? Always pay attention to not just what people are saying, but what they're not saying as well, and how they're not saying it. I'm going to skip that one. I talked about the beta tester. If FDA asks you to do something, must you do it? Absolutely not. When I go into a pre-sub meeting, FDA can say, well, before you start, Mike, I want you to stand on one foot and jump up and down. Right? Just because they ask you to do something doesn't mean that you have to do it. But if you're going to not do it, you have to justify why you're not going to do it, and probably have an alternative. Right? And as I said earlier, and this is perhaps the most important, you have to pick your battles. Some things are worth battling over, other things are not. You have to pick which ones are worth fighting over for you. I've seen so many times when a company will just roll over and just do whatever FDA asks them to do. And by the way, I have to be a little careful what I say here. Sometimes when I'm working as a consultant for the FDA, I will purposely ask a company, why are they not doing something when I, as a professional biomedical engineer, don't think they need to do it, or why they're drawing a line in a particular place where me, as a professional biomedical engineer, agreed where they drew the line. I will purposely ping them on it. Why? Because if they give to me some response based on engineering or biology, that's wonderful. But if they give me some response, well, that's the way the 25 companies did before me, so therefore that's what I'm doing. I'm sorry, that doesn't cut it with me, and I'll be all over them with like a cheap suit. Now, again, how many reviewers do that? I have no idea. I suspect probably not very many. But to me, this is all predicated on the engineering and the biology, not the regulation. And this brings us to the next, perhaps most important question. What's FDA's most important job? When FDA is doing their job, and believe me, they do not always do their job. When FDA is doing their job is very simple, to be critical of everything. In other words, if you go into the FDA and say the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. That's the way this game is supposed to be played. Whether it's always played that way or not, that's a different issue, but their job is to criticize everything, even when I agree with what you're doing. And by the way, that's not just FDA's job. That should be the job of your regulatory professionals in your company as well, is to be critical of everything that happens in R&D, in manufacturing, and everything else. You know, one of my friends who's a senior VP of regulatory and quality at a Fortune 100 medical device company, he and I were best friends at graduate school. He and I did a co-presentation at AdvaMed a couple of years ago, and he said something that always stuck with me. He said, if you're working in regulatory and people like you, you're not doing your job. If you're working in regulatory and people like you, you're not doing your job. Right? It's not your job in regulatory to just give high fives to everybody and say, hey, you're all doing a wonderful job, pat yourself on the back. You know, just like in the design controls, you know, you can tick off the box of independent reviewer if you have an engineer come in and say, oh, your device is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You may have, and you may have met the letter of the law, the letter of the regulation. You certainly have not met the intent of the regulation. What's more important? So to wrap this up, I want to share with you some tips to improve your FDA communication strategy. Many of these we've talked about already. This is in a column that I published for MDDI a couple of years ago now. Don't treat the FDA as an obstacle. You know, so many people, they walk into the agency with the attitude, what's the minimum that I have to do in order to sign off, in order for you to sign off on whatever it is that I want you to sign off on? And to me, that is so troubling. Right? That is not the way this is supposed to work. Again, let me share a story. Perhaps one of the most common questions that I get from companies across the board. I get this question every week, sometimes every day. I say, somebody comes to me and says, Mike, you work with lots of different companies, you also work with the FDA. If we came to the FDA with our new widget, our new medical device, whatever it is, what do you think FDA is going to want to see in terms of benchtop testing, animal testing, clinical testing, and so on? I say, look, I understand why you're asking me that question. I understand why that's an important question to you. But let's look at this in a completely different perspective. Let's remove the FDA from the equation. Let's pretend that FDA did not exist. Sooner or later, a family member, a friend, perhaps even yourself is going to be on the receiving end of your medical device. When that day occurs, what is it going to take for you as an individual, for me, Mike, to say that this device is okay to be used in my neighbor, in my spouse, in my case, my 2.5-year-old grandson. And then, and only then, should we go to the agency and have an intelligent discussion about what needs to be done to bring this particular product onto the market. It's a very different approach, but it's my approach. In some cases, I think the regulation is appropriate for a device. In other cases, I think the regulation is too much. And in some cases, I think the regulation is not enough. Have a plan to communicate with the FDA. We've talked about that already. Don't just bring regulatory folks to a pre-sub meeting. You know, sometimes we talked about lawyers a moment ago. Sometimes people ask me, should we bring an engineer to our pre-sub meeting? And I usually say yes, and then the company says, well, we're a little concerned. What if the engineer says something that they're not supposed to say? I have a PhD in engineering. I understand their mentality. So here's what I say to the company. If that's a legitimate concern to you, then treat the engineer like a child. In other words, say to them, don't speak unless you're spoken to, and even if you're spoken to, don't speak anyway. Again, I hope everybody appreciates my not-so-subtle use of humor here. I think it's important enough to have the person, your engineer or R&D or manufacturer or whoever it is, in the room, even if they don't say anything. Why? Because otherwise, you run the risk of playing the telephone game. The people from the meeting are going to go back to the company, and they're going to have to tell the other people what they think the FDA said to them. Right? Anybody remember playing the telephone game when you were a kid? You're sitting in a circle with 20 kids. One kid tells a story to the next, to the next, to the next. By the time it comes around, you end up with a completely different story. I don't want to play that game. Right? So bring those people with you, even if you decide to treat them as a child. That's up to you. Okay? What else? It's never too soon to set up a meeting with the FDA. We talked about that. Master the art of silence, and you'll learn a lot. My wife is very good at that. There's no better way to find out how somebody feels than to stop talking. And sooner or later, if you stop talking long enough, most people feel uncomfortable with silence. The other person will say something. They will say, are you alive? Or something like that. Okay? So master the art of silence. It's a very powerful technique. Also, sometimes when you request a meeting, FDA says, oh, we're busy, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you can appeal to them as engineers. In other words, if you have a technology that's a little different that they haven't seen before, or you can spin it in a way that that makes it interesting to them, that might make it more attractive. That might push you up on the ladder, so to speak, for having a meeting or a phone conversation. And last, if I haven't beat you over the head with this enough, on one hand, it's never it's never too frequent to talk to the FDA. But remember my caveat. Tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow, right? So don't go down there, please, and ask them, what should we do? It's just not their job, it's your job. And if you don't know that, then with all due respect, you shouldn't be in this business. It's as simple as that. Communicate early, communicate often, communicate honestly. This is why, and thank you, sir, for asking this question, but this is why it starts to make me a little nervous sometimes when people ask me, do we really need to say this to the FDA or something like that? That's not something that I really advocate. So bottom line, this should be a partnership, this should be a negotiation, this should be a meeting of the minds. It should not be a hurdle. It should definitely not be subservient like this by having to ask FDA questions, but that's at the moment what the process is involved. And it's harder to accomplish when we're not in the room together. Believe me, it's hard enough when we are all in the room, but it's even harder when we're not in the room. So we've talked a lot about the pre-sub process and what it does and lots of tips and tricks. Let me just quickly wrap up with a couple of final thoughts, and then if anybody has any final questions, I'd be happy to talk about them before we run out of time. Don't just follow the rules, think. Douglas MacArthur said that rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind it. This is one of my favorite slides to show, especially at RAPS conferences, as some of you can appreciate why, because to regulatory folks, this is heresy, right? Flat out heresy. People will be throwing things at me, which I would argue is a good thing because at least I know they're awake. But here's what I mean. Please don't miss my message. I'm not saying that rules are not important. I'm not saying that we should just willy-nilly break the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But what I am saying is this: if the rules make sense, then follow them. If the rules don't make sense, as they often do, and we follow them anyway, and we agree that they don't make sense, and yet we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? Rules, all regulations should be thought of as guidance, as suggestion, as a starting point only. Something to think about. There are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but there are very, very few good ones. One thing I used to say to my medical students, every surgeon has graduated from medical school, but does that mean that every surgeon is equally as good? Absolutely not. The same thing can be said about attorneys and about engineers, and dare I say it, about regulatory professionals. So how do you become a good one, or how do you find a good one if that's your goal? Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. Because if it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first to walk into the FDA as a pre-sub and in 72-point font in my PowerPoint say, I'm doing nothing more than the people before me. End of discussion. Don't let the door hit you in the you-know-what on the way out. On the other hand, if it's not to my advantage or if it's not possible to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first to work with the FDA to carve out a new path. Because if you're following in somebody else's footsteps, as so many people in this industry do, there's one thing I can guarantee. You will never go anywhere new. If you're following in somebody else's footsteps, you will never go anywhere new. Or put another way, if you want to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. And this is something that, quite frankly, not enough people in our industry, especially the regulatory community, do. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. This is one of my favorite philosophies to share, especially with regulatory folks. Why? Because if you read a regulation and understand it and interpret it and follow it the way the hundreds or thousands of other people have done before you, then with all due respect, you're adding no value, and any monkey can do that. But if you read a regulation and see in it something that nobody else has seen before and use it to do something that nobody else has done before, now you're adding very significant value, because let's be honest, not everybody can do that. But that's one thing that I try to do. Michelangelo, not just a wonderful philosopher, but not just a great artist, but a wonderful philosopher, said the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but rather that it's too low and we reach it. So where are we as individuals, as companies aiming, whereas we as an industry are aiming? Simply put, if we set the bar higher, we will achieve more. But if we set the bar so low that we just about trip going over it, what have we really accomplished? And finally, and this is the end, I promise, if we're going to take inspiration, let's take the inspiration from one of the best, Steve Jobs, who changed our world in some very profound ways, not just in evolutionary ways, but revolutionary ways. Let me share with you one of his very first TV commercials from Apple Computer, where he talked about the crazy ones. Watch this.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Call me crazy, call me naive, and certainly many people do, but I'm trying to change the world. I'm trying to make the world a better place, one person at a time. It's taking a very long time. And believe me, I can use some help if anybody wants to come and help me. And by no means am I going to be so arrogant as to stand in front of you and put myself in the category of Steve Jobs. However, when I gave my presentation on competitive regulatory strategy at the MD&M in Anaheim a couple of years ago to an audience of about 300 people, one of the editors in MDDI magazine wrote up a column on my presentation, and she characterized me as a regulatory rebel. So in that sense, perhaps Steve Jobs might be proud. And the very last quote to share with you is one of my favorites. Imagine where we could be today if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. Imagine where we could be today if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. Anybody want to guess as to who said that? Most of you don't know me before today, but I said this in one of my very first columns about a dozen years ago. Imagine where we could be today if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. So at that point, I mean, that's a pretty good overview of the precept. I think there's tons and tons more we can talk about. But I wanted to reserve the last 10 minutes or so of our time for any additional questions. And I know that some of you might not be able to stick around, or if you have a question that you don't want to ask in front of the group, feel free to call me or email me. There is a handout. I'm not sure I guess I'll be providing it to the conference folks, but if you don't get it, send me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you. But I want to thank everybody for their attention. If there's anything I can do to help in the future, let me know. Good luck. And then you had a question, please.
So can we request 2 pre-sub meetings at the same time, such as one for non-clinical study, one for clinical study?
At the same time, I'm not sure what you mean. On the same, you're going to have 2 different meetings, but on the same day, or?
So can we submit 2 pre-sub at, not at the same time, but overlap, like, because...
You're talking about the content of the pre-sub meeting, correct?
Yes.
So here's what's your first name?
Ken.
Chen?
Ken.
Ken, okay. So here's my best advice, Ken. Remember I said, unlike regular submissions, the content of the pre-sub is totally up to you. You can make it as broad or alternatively as narrow as you want. So in your particular case, you can choose to include the clinical or not to choose the clinical. That's up to you. It's a little hard for me to give you a more specific response if I don't know, what your product is and what your situation is, but does that kind of answer your question?
So, like, if I submit a pre-sub, or request a pre-sub, like, then I need to wait for 2 months to get the FDA.
Maybe less, maybe 6 weeks.
To meet with FDA, right?
Yeah.
During this process, can I submit another pre-sub?
Oh. The short answer is yes, you probably can. but I'm not sure that I would want to, because, again, you're increasing the likelihood of confusion. I'm assuming that this is the same device, same indication, same regulatory strategy, all that, right? So that means that some, if not many, of the people in that first meeting are also going to be in the second meeting. Now you have the whole issues of, well, somebody asked a question in this meeting, but you have to say to them, we're going to talk about that in our next meeting. I think that it has the potential to get a little messy. What I would suggest instead is to maybe include the clinical information. Is your concern that you have too much information to... Okay. So in that case, you have to prioritize. You have to triage. What is the most important information? What do you need to know sooner? And what other things can you wait a little longer on? Think about it this way, because you were asking about the clinical question. 510K versus de novo, I mean, it doesn't really matter. That's administrative, that's paperwork. But whether or not you need to do a clinical trial, and if so, how big, that's something, especially if you're looking to raise money, that's something that you really need to know sooner rather than later. Right? So I would apply a little engineering 101. The first thing I would do is a brainstorming session. What are all of the different goals and objectives that you would like to accomplish during this pre-sub? Make a laundry list. No matter how important or how less important, doesn't matter. That's step number one. Step number two then is to triage them or prioritize them. Break them up into 2 or 3 groups. Maybe one group, this is like the most important things we need to focus on sooner. These things we really don't need to know, like sterility, shelf life, stability. We don't need to know that until later. And then this stuff is the stuff in between. That's probably what I would suggest. But again, without having more information about your particular situation, it would be hard for me to give more specific advice. Yes, sir, Joe?
Smile.
Oh, my son says I have a face for radio. So.
His presentation is not over, but if I don't stand in front of a room for long periods of time, I get a little kind of tired. Who thought that this was a great presentation?
Yay.
It's not good, actually. I just been told you it was. Who wants a copy of the deck? My advice to you is throw business cards at Michael. It's fun, and it'll be a way that we're sure to get them to you in a timely way.
And I have cards here as well, too, if anybody wants one.
How many of you are sticking around for the next 2 days as well? And you have the chance to hear him speak twice more about other things I don't understand. So
you might not want to say that, Joe, because they might not come back.
The cards, believe me, if I could explain it, then it would not be a worthwhile presentation.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you to Joe and the other organizers of the conference for the invitation to come. I greatly appreciate the opportunity, and certainly thank you to you in the audience for coming, because otherwise I'd be talking to myself. So, do we have maybe 5 more minutes for questions? Okay. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Is it normal to share some preliminary data during the pre-sub meeting?
Good question. What's your first name now?
Piyush.
Piyush. Excellent question, Piyush. Thank you for asking that. So, whether it's normal or not, I don't really care. Let's not worry about being normal or average. But here's the more important point. It is CDRH's policy, and I agree with them on this, not to review data during the actual pre-sub process. The review of the data, that occurs at the submission, not at the pre-sub. However, if I have data that I would like to share with the FDA as part of the pre-sub, I will, and I usually say this as a matter of professional courtesy, we have this data, we're sharing it with you, we're not expecting you to necessarily say anything about it, but here it is. If they want to say something about it, more power to them. But here's the problem with that. The policy actually makes it more difficult to accomplish some of the most important pre-sub objectives. Like, for example, 510K versus de novo, right? If you could go either way. FDA's policy is not to make a determination of substantial equivalence or not until they see all of the data. That drives me nuts. As a professional biomedical engineer, I can look at the testing matrix, the testing methodology, and I can say, okay, if you do this series of tests and the data comes out this way, then likely it will be substantially equivalent. And so while the FDA won't review the data, what I almost always do in the pre-sub, one of the meeting objectives, one of the questions I will say, based on our labeling and our technology, have we demonstrated that the testing matrix that we're providing here is a complete and comprehensive list of all of the tests necessary to show safety, effectiveness, substantial equivalence, whatever it is. Because what I want to avoid is a very common scenario. I see this happen all the time, where a company makes a submission, they do, say, 10 tests, FDA says, well, we would like you to do this 1 or 2 additional tests, and they throw it right back in your face. That's such an amateur mistake. It is totally a rookie mistake. It's a very easy mistake to greatly mitigate, if not completely avoid, by presenting your testing matrix as part of the pre-sub process. So in terms of the data itself, yes or no, but in terms of the testing matrix, absolutely. Good question. Yes, sir.
Mike, I got a quick question. Is there a standard or an average time that elapses between a successful pre-sub meeting and the submissions that go? And how does that change?
It's a good question. What's your first name?
Mike.
Mike? Oh, that's easy for me to remember. It's a great question. I don't know what the average is. I'm not sure that FDA keeps track of those statistics as part of MANUFA. I can tell you from my personal experience, it ranges across the board. In some cases where a company is at the point of design freeze, at that particular case, when they do a pre-sub, they might design the pre-sub so that it's very, very similar to what the actual submission is going to look like. That way, assuming that everything goes well with the pre-sub, then, now it's just probably a matter of a few weeks before you're able to repackage it into your final submission. On the other hand, if you're talking about maybe a class 3 kind of device, then you're probably not going to finish off in a couple of weeks. So on the short end, it might be a couple of weeks to maybe a month or 2. On the longer end, it could be many months, in some cases many years. Good question. Thank you, Mike. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So in the beginning, you talked about substantial equivalence being the major reason for rejections. And your competition and similar devices, but if you're developing something that's not in the market yet, but competition is a little bit of ahead. Is there any information available what any regulatory pathway they did? FDA obviously knows that.
So let me just make sure I understand your question. So you're talking about developing something that is not on the market yet, to use your phrase. I would think by definition that means we're not talking about a 510K.
PMA, it would be PMA.
It could be a PMA if it's class 3, but if it's still class 2 or class 1, it could be a de novo.
It's a combination, so
that's a combination product. Oh, well then that's a whole different issue. So what's the question again? I'm sorry.
Is any information public, like what path they like the competition took, like what pathway?
Well, hold on a second. So I'm a little confused because a moment ago you said there's no product on the market.
Yeah, but if they are, for example, they already have clinical trials.
Oh, so the other company is not on the market yet, but they're maybe a few steps ahead of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're probably not going to know what exactly their regulatory strategy is until everything is done and it's published. That said, you mentioned a clinical trial. Okay. Now this gets into a much more advanced topic of discussion, but by looking at the design of the clinical trial, I can pretty much reverse engineer their regulatory strategy. So and this is why sometimes companies come to me because they don't want to do a clinical trial because they don't want to put it in clinicaltrials.gov because there's other people out there like me that can reverse engineer their regulatory strategy. That's no. But is that what you're kind of asking? Yeah. Or sometimes people will ask, if you're going to the FDA with a de novo, how do you know that there's not somebody else with a de novo for a very similar product that might be a few steps ahead of you? It's kind of like intellectual property, first to file versus first to invent. Thank you. So FDA, at least officially, doesn't have a clean mechanism like that, but to be honest, I don't think it happens very often. Yes, sir, please.
How would you know if you have to go to the FDA or not with your product?
That's a good question. I'm assuming that you're thinking about wellness devices, the wellness exemption.
Physical therapy.
Yeah. So this is a great question. It's really a topic of a whole different discussion. If you're talking about, let me say it this way. So there are a ton of medical devices out there that are medical devices, no question about it, but they are not regulated by FDA as medical devices, many of which you see advertised on the TV. About 2 years ago, FDA put out this guidance on what's called the wellness exemption. In my opinion, they probably opened up a Pandora's box here. They've created more problems than what it's worth, and it's a very rapidly growing part of my business is doing exactly this, but asking that question. The best answer I can give you at the moment, sir, is you might consider using the pre-RFD process. For a pre-sub, it's probably overkill to ask the question, is this a regulated medical device? But using the pre-RFD process is probably the best thing that we have for the moment to answer that question. It's not binding, but nothing is binding. And if you want, I'd be happy to talk to you about that more individually. Thank you.
This is the part where we clap enthusiastically for mine.